And that is not dramatizing it in any way. It is an existential issue. The issue that we're dealing with is one that could result in, the very viability of our economies, of the societies that we currently live in, hanging in the balance. And not in 100 years, not in 50 years, in 25 years, in 30 years, right? So we cannot afford to give up hope. And there is a lot happening as well at the international level to continue to give us hope. Hopefully, we are right on the cusp of a global renewable energy renaissance. Hopefully, that will also have an impact on our societies, our economies. But again, we have to be positioned in order to be able to receive that and not just be on the tag tail end where, in Japan, for example, they're changing over all of their vehicles to e-vehicles, and on the other side, dumping all their cheap foreign used internal combustion engine vehicles in the Caribbean. And yes, I will say it, and even on record, because it is true. And so there are a number of issues that we have to be able to grapple with, even in a context where we keep hope alive. So I'll pause there.
Thank you. You have dropped a lot of knowledge in the time, and we're so grateful to have you with us. I'd love to open the floor for reflections, questions and reflections. Here you go.
Hi, Rueanna. Myrico Morris.
Hi, Myrico. How are you? How are you
I'm
doing?
good. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you. It's nice to see you again.
It is nice to also see you again. I was excited when you were speaking. I have one quick question. In respect of the emissions set to increase by 11% by 2030, what does this say in with the global stocktake, the polluter pay principle, and also the loss and damage funds that are to be established in terms of climate financing?
Yeah. So that's an interesting question. Of course, we know from the sixth assessment report of the IPCC that with every 10th of degree of an increase in warming, there will be more loss and damage, right? We know that. And so the fact that we are on track to go in the opposite direction than where we're meant to go really underlines 3 times in red the need for and the urgent need for loss and damage finance to be in place. The need for us to come out of this COP having a proper understanding of how these loss and damage funding arrangements are going to be administered. Where will the fund sit? Will it be a standalone fund? Who can access? How can they access? Is there going to be a special route for access for SIDS considering the special circumstances of SIDS? So all of these issues are on the fire for this COP. And this question of the polluter pays principle, I mean, it is a principle of international environmental law. It does underscore much of what we've agreed so far in the global climate regime in the context of the convention, the Kyoto Protocol, which it's basically why the Kyoto Protocol was structured the way it was, with commitments only for quote unquote the biggest polluters. In the context of the Paris Agreement, the waters are a little bit more muddied, a little bit more complex, right? And as I said, under the PIKE, the compliance regime, it is not a punitive regime. It's not a regime where the polluter pays principle comes through at all in the context of the Paris Agreement compliance. But we do have running in parallel to everything that is happening within UN climate change, the various advisory opinions that are being sought in international courts globally. And we also do have a number of national level climate change cases, climate litigation happening in particular in the developed world. And this, I think, is where we will see the development of the polluter pays principle and how it can continue to apply in the context of climate change. Of course, when we're thinking about legal cases, and I've heard some very, very luminary legal academics speak disparagingly about the Paris Agreement. It has no teeth, it can't do anything. The solution for climate change lies in the courts. I respectfully disagree. What will happen in the context of the court matters and is going to be very, very valuable for helping us to understand how we should interpret the obligations of the Paris Agreement and to help us to understand what are the actual obligations that each country has in relation to addressing climate change towards their own citizens and also towards citizens of the world. But the changes that will be brought about on a case-by-case basis are just that. Changes brought about on a case-by-case basis. And so they will be incremental. But we are now in a context where what we need to see happen is transformational change and not incremental change. So there is a space and a role for all of these initiatives to play a major part. And I, for one, welcome each and every one of them. And I hope to see them multiply. But they also have to work hand in hand and alongside what has already been set in train by the Paris Agreement itself. And there's so much that needs to be worked out. So, for example, we have to discuss at this COP this question of, for the first time in the history of the climate regime process, setting targets that are sectorally based. So not just high-level mitigation, high-level adaptation, but actual specific targets for particular sectors. So for the fossil fuel industry, for example, talking about continuing the discussion that started in 2021 with the agreement on an unabated coal phase down, but expanding that now out to hopefully a fossil fuel phase out globally. But how actually is that going to operate? We don't know. There's no agreement. There are a lot of countries that are saying, well, it's an unabated phase out, which means we're only going to be phasing out, fossil fuel emissions and not actually the fossil fuel industry. So there's a whole debate happening around that as well. There's also a debate around, the idea of the renewable energy revolution, which we are already in and which will continue to pick up speed, and the notion of setting renewable energy targets. So the EU has agreed amongst themselves to a global renewable energy target of tripling renewable energy by a particular date, and they are running around trying to get everybody else to agree to that. But the question is, will that be enough? Because if what we need to see is transformational change, piling on renewable energy on top of an already unsustainable fossil fuel-based global economy probably will not get us to where we need to go, which means more need for adaptation, which means more loss and damage, right? Which means several societies in 25 to 30 years probably being on the brink of actual collapse. And so the discussion, we'll see how it goes, but there are many who are of the view that what we actually need to see happen alongside a renewable energy revolution and renewable energy targets would be an effective fossil fuel phase out alongside phasing out of inefficient or fossil fuel subsidies on the whole in a manner that redirects some of that finance, and the fossil fuel subsidies globally are in the trillions, yeah? So in a manner that redirects some of that finance to where it needs to go in the context of adaptation, in the context of loss and damage. But we'll see how it goes.
Well, do you believe the carbon markets would be a trade-off for the polluter pay principle?
Will it be a trade-off for the polluter pays principle? Well, carbon markets have a role to play. We have Article 6 of the Paris Agreement that sets up the mechanisms and the conditions for parties to cooperate in the context of a carbon market. Right now, we do not have a functional global carbon market. We do not have a price on carbon that can be globally applied. Carbon markets have the potential to work well alongside a shift away at the global level from a fossil fuel-based global economy, alongside a renewable energy revolution, and alongside a phase out of inefficient fossil fuels. But carbon markets by themselves will not solve the problem. And we are still in the process of setting up a lot of that machinery, both at the global level and within countries, to ensure that it actually functions in a way that is consistent with the principles of environmental integrity. So carbon markets are useful. They hold a lot of promise, but I would say their value right now is quite limited if we want to depend on those alone and not actually go the route of doing the other elements that need to be done.
Okay, so I'll ask the next question. Hi, Rueanna. Alicia from Trinidad and Tobago.
Hi, Alicia. Good to see you again.
Hi, nice to see you again also. So I just wanted to ask, I noted that you said that in terms of determining NDCs for Caribbean SIDS that were not intricately part of the Kyoto Protocol process, it's kind of, all and anything goes, all man for themselves type of thing. And I was just wondering if you could shed some more light on whether you think that is something that is counterproductive, and to what extent there's regional cohesion in how Caribbean SIDS go about developing their NDCs, and if that's something that you think we should be promoting more. And I also wanted to hear, what are your thoughts on using the whole global stocktake process as a tool for climate justice, especially considering the fact that many countries do not believe in the follow-up aspect, which I personally think is where the effectiveness of the whole process comes into play. So those are my questions.
Easy questions today, boy. All right. I'll take the last question first. This question of the linkage between climate justice and the global stocktake. I actually think you're right, Alicia. The global stocktake really holds tremendous potential to advance climate justice principles globally in a way that makes sense. The process itself has already begun to do that, I would argue, considering that it is the most inclusive process that we've ever had within the UN global climate regime to date, with the number of stakeholders who were involved, who had a seat at the table. And my view is that in the outcomes, we need to be able to build on this, including in the context of follow-up. So one of the really interesting things that happened in the course of the global stocktake technical assessment phase was this notion of the just transition coming very much to the fore in a way that it had not before. We had discussed it somewhat previously in the process. It's included in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. There's a little line there on the just transition alongside a number of other principles that are supposed to operate, but it had never really been taken forward, and it is being taken forward now. So we already have, in a way, some follow-up and outputs coming from the GST process, because last year, so this is even before the completion of the GST technical assessment phase, parties agreed to launch a Just Transition Work Program, which has started operations this year. And this, to me, is a huge success of the way the GST was conducted and the way that it was able to bring many issues in relation to climate justice to the fore. And I hope to see these issues carried forward in the context of the way the Just Transition Work Program is planned and the way the follow-up is planned for the Just Transition Work Program. I think that in spite of the opposition to a follow-up on the GST, there will be some follow-up on the GST. The question will be how robust it is, how extensive it is. And that is what we have to wait and see. That is what has to be negotiated. So I think there is still a lot of hope to be able to advance climate justice principles in the context of the GST outcome because of the way the process was run. And this is something that we should be looking forward to in the region as well, because there will be implications for regional stakeholders. And I think it could actually also provide a bit of energy and a bit of a platform for the further engagement of stakeholders, including the youth, in climate action generally. In relation to your first question, it sounded like a question that was going to get me in trouble. That's why I hesitated on it. Just remind me again what you wanted to hear about.
I wanted to know more about the extent to which Caribbean SIDS cooperate in establishing the NDCs.
Yeah. So there is cooperation. There is cooperation right now. Caribbean SIDS participates in a partnership called the NDC Partnership, which is a conglomerate of different organizations, bilateral donors like the Germans, the French, some others, and global organizations, including my own climate analytics, participate to help developing countries, including SIDS, to design their NDCs. And this has brought a level of discipline to the NDC design process, somewhat. But keep in mind that the vehicle is called nationally determined. So that is what guides the way NDCs are developed. So even though there is sharing of lessons learned, and there is a bit of coordination, it's very loose and it's at the technical level, not at the political level. But it does exist. Generally, what we see is that NDCs are guided by national level priorities. So some countries envision NDC documents as national investment plans or national level development plans, or a summary of existing national level development plans, which means they design their NDCs in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 agenda. So, but other countries conceive of it quite differently. I do not think that variety is bad per se. I do think, though, that there needs to be a lot more discipline around some of the core elements of the NDC. So around the expression of the mitigation commitments or the undertakings, for example, to ensure that they are measurable, to ensure that we can actually add them up so that we know what the collective level of ambition is based on these NDCs, to ensure that they can be reported against, because that's the other obligation in the Paris Agreement under Article 13, the obligation to report on. You have to report on the implementation of your NDC, but you do not have to report on whether or not you've met your NDC. Right? So there's a little bit of a distinction there, but the reporting requirements still do create some level of accountability because there are set and standardized formats that have to be grappled with. And I know in the region, there is a very well coordinated effort to build capacity to be able to respond to these reporting requirements. So at least that is underway. And I think because the Paris Agreement reporting regime is only coming into effect next year, not this year. So we've had the Paris Agreement in place since 2016. Reporting doesn't start until 2024. And that was a better negotiated point, and I won't revisit it. But it only starts in 2024. I think once reporting gets underway, that will also assist in being able to standardize a bit more what or how parties approach NDCs.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else has a question?
Hello, hi, Rueanna Shandell from Trinidad and Tobago again. Right now, it's just
Hello. Hi,
hi,
Chandel. Is this
hi,
room full of the usual suspects? Is that
a
what's
little
happening?
bit, a little bit, a little bit. Uh, right now, this new COP28 is happening in Dubai, UAE, and it seems like the global stocktake might get lost in everything else because it seems it's turning into a big hullabaloo, expo, city, all these kind of things, side events, and people are losing focus on what's really going on. So my question, I guess, is what is the likelihood of like a good outcome from the GST final text for AOSIS and other SIDS? Thanks. Well, AOSIS SIDS, thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. What's a good outcome? So first of all, AOSIS has called for a three-part outcome to the GST. So from the AOSIS perspective, the GST outputs should be structured along the lines of a political declaration issued by heads of state and government, and they will be in Dubai for a World Leaders Conference on the 1st and 2nd of November, as well as a decision text agreed by parties, agreed by ministers in the final hours of the COP, and a technical annex that contains best practices, lessons learned, and all the richness of the technical information that came through the technical assessment phase of the GST. Of course, there's bitter and vehement opposition to this three-part approach to the outcome of the GST. But I will say that it is gaining some ground. We know, for example, that it is very likely that the presidency, the incoming presidency, the UAE, will be working towards a political declaration that they might already be ready to consult at the pre-COP, which is happening in the following week in Abu Dhabi. In terms of the decision text, that's where the situation gets tricky. As I said, it is mayhem and bacchanal in those negotiations because parties just do not agree on the approach. That being said, I think there is still hope. There is still hope that we will get a substantive enough decision to support further work and follow-up, but there will be trade-offs happening, not necessarily within the GST discussions, but with the issues outside. So with the report of the Transitional Committee for the Loss and Damage Fund, for example, there might be some trade-offs against that on the GST. There might be some trade-offs with the mitigation work program as well. There might be trade-offs in relation to finance as well in particular. So right now, what's happening is that parties are more or less in the process of gathering their chips for the negotiations that have to take place in Dubai. Specifically, AOSIS is looking for a GST political declaration that helps to move the needle, on climate action, that acknowledges the gaps that exist in Paris Agreement implementation, but that gives hope to the international community that all is not lost, that 1.5 degrees Celsius is still on the table, that all parties are still committed to keeping that limit in relation to average global warming, and that parties are going to take actions in order to get there. So the whole purpose of the political declaration is really, from an AOSIS point of view, to set the sense of direction. So the objective of the GST is quite a lofty one. It's not just assessing how we're doing, it's also reflecting on the process, the entire process that has been set up in order to deal with this crisis of the commons, right? That is climate change. So we need a political declaration that is capable of being honest, capable of setting the direction, capable of inspiring. And then for the CMA decision, AOSIS has been calling for a CMA decision that first and foremost treats loss and damage as a separate issue, as with the level of importance that it actually requires. Because if you think back to what Article 14 says, it doesn't speak to loss and damage. In terms of the themes that the GST is supposed to pick up, it speaks to mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation and support in the light of equity and the best available science. So even ensuring that loss and damage could be considered in the context of the GST outcome was a big fight, is a big fight. But we've gained a lot of traction in this fight to date. We also want to see a decision text that commits parties to the actions that are needed in order to course correct and get us on track to limit warming to within 1.5 degrees. So in mitigation, that means a commitment to global peaking by 2025. It means a commitment to bringing forward new and enhanced NDCs in 2025, right, that are qualitatively and quantitatively better than the NDCs that we have on the table. It also means perhaps setting those sectoral targets in relation to the shift away from a fossil fuel-based economy in relation to phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, and in relation to renewable energy targets. So the studies show that what we really need is something like a five-fold increase in wind and solar every year between now and 2030 in order to get us to where we need to go. Now, that is a huge undertaking, but the studies also show that based on the current trajectory of renewable energy expansion, it is achievable. So putting the highest ambition sectoral targets on the table is also a part of what we might want to see either in the decision text or in the political declaration. In terms of adaptation, the story is a little bit more complex. The international community is working on a framework for the implementation of a global goal on adaptation that is not very well defined, frankly speaking, in the context of Article 21B of the Paris Agreement. But we do expect in the decision text to be able to continue that job of ensuring that adaptation is getting the treatment that it deserves, speaking to fulfilling existing commitments for the provision or the doubling of adaptation finance by 2025 and creating some accountability around that as well, and also giving some political direction to the framework for the global goal on adaptation and how it is to be implemented and how it can feed into the next global stocktake, which will start in 2026. So basically, it's right around the corner. In relation to loss and damage, it's a question of underscoring all of the different gaps that exist and continue to exist in the regime in relation to loss and damage. I mean, adaptation has been treated as a stepchild. I mean, loss and damage has been treated even worse. And so in terms of loss and damage, it's about linking into the decision that we expect to come to operationalize the funding arrangements for the loss and damage fund. And it also links to some of the technical work that needs to be done to help countries even to be able to access that fund. So questions around setting indicators to understand what exactly is loss and damage, how is it different from adaptation, how is it being measured within the countries that are experiencing it the most. There are huge gaps there in terms of the data. So we're hoping that the GST decision can call for some of these metrics to be developed at the global level so we can start to measure loss and damage and to also provide a platform for helping countries to be able to access the fund. In relation to means of implementation and support, including finance, the situation is extremely murky. Of course, we have the 100 billion goal, we'll have to reference that, but parties are also at this time involved in a process called the NCQG, where they are negotiating a new collective quantified goal on finance. And that process isn't going to be completed till 2025, I believe. And so there's a lot of hesitation around preempting that process and setting finance goals ahead of the conclusion of that process. And so in terms of means of implementation and support, AOSIS has focused in a bit more on the capacity building and the technology side. So calling for an international capacity building program to help countries to be able to design NDCs, one that goes beyond the current programs, because the current programs in place are dictated by ODA funding, bilateral ODA funding, which means that it excludes middle-income countries that might be considered high-income, middle-income countries. And we know we have a few of them in the region. So that's why we think it would be important to set up a global process on NDCs, as well as this question of encouraging the development of SIDS-specific and SIDS-appropriate technologies. So thinking about renewable energy through a SIDS lens and trying to ensure that SIDS are not left out of this renewable energy revolution that is taking place. So that's where we're focused in terms of this question of means of implementation and support. But there's a lot of fighting that still has to happen there on this question of finance in particular. And of course, AUSIS has also proposed a robust follow-up process to the GST around accountability, around also some of the pledges that have been undertaken by non-state actors, so private sector in particular, other institutions that exist outside of the process, and getting some accountability around how those are being met, but also for the purpose of preparing for the next GST, which will start in 2026. So a bit of a mouthful, but that's the overview on what AUSIS has been asking for.
So much. You have provided us with a wealth of knowledge as it relates to the NDCs, the global stocktake, and in earnest sort of what we need to do as young people. And I think one of my takeaways is that we can't give up. You know, like I listen to you and I am overwhelmed with the reality. You know, when you said 5 times, 5-fold of what we're doing now as it relates to solar and wind, and it just seems daunting because I see the pace that we're not moving at. And, you know, so, but you also at the same breath said it's achievable and it's possible. And so that is what I think we really need to hold on to. And I think if anything that I'm walking away from this conversation is that we get to create our future. And with the brains that we have in this room, if the world doesn't know who we are as a Caribbean massive, then that's on us. And it's not fair, it's unjust, we know this. You know, climate justice exists because there are injustices in this world. And as most of us in this room, as Rueanna really pointed out, is that like our ancestors were the blood, sweat, and tears that created this system, you know, that were brutalized in the creation of this system that's now threatening our existing lives. So this is not in a vacuum. There's a lot of historical context that's grounding why we are here today. And we get to march on and march forward. And so as we march to our coffee break and then come back to come and do our closing reflection and action plan, I really want you to think about, I hope you've been inspired by this last panel that really like just lay it out on the table. You know, we know that they're not coming to save us. So the question is, how are we going to save ourselves? How are we going to strategically place ourselves within the systems so that we can move the system forward? Whether we take a chapter from Adele's book and lean hard into the publication of reports that tell the story of Caribbean islanders, or understanding how we amplify adaptation, because that is what is required. We need to be able to adapt so that we can continue to live. And it also means we have to start having the tough decisions. The next time the hurricane passes through, you know, do we rebuild? And if we don't rebuild, then it's time for us to have in earnest these conversations about what it means for us, what it means for our future, and what it means for the people who don't have the privilege to be in this room today, having the conversations and thinking longer term, as so many of our brothers and sisters are in crisis mode, just trying to get through the moment in the day. So thank you so much, Rueanna. We're so blessed to have your knowledge, your insight with us, and we will continue to do the work. Thank you again.
Thank you, and all the best with the rest of the conference, and congratulations already. Take care.
Bye, thank you. All right, everyone, we kind of rolled through our coffee break there, but I felt like that was really important because there was some serious knowledge being shared. So let's jump up, jump outdoors, enjoy the coffee and the cakes, and then let's come back in for our closing session, reflection, and action.